chapters 1 and 2 on how to read and think and write like an historian. First of all, the researchers that present this research in this book, they are looking only at history. And their research was done in order to help students read, think, and write like an historian. The C3 framework is the set of standards that framed their research. That stands for college, career, and civic life for social studies. Now, history is different from, say, government. So just keep in mind that the book that we're reading is just about reading and thinking and writing for history in particular, not other social studies like government. So basically what the researchers found in our book is that the C3 framework requires that you have a lot of subject matter knowledge, so you have to know content. You also need to know how to do historical inquiry in their case, inquiry in general for the social studies, and you have to have disciplinary ways of thinking. So they are looking at the disciplinary ways of thinking about history. So what are the disciplinary ways of thinking in history? First of all, they focus on analyzing a range of historical sources and writing an argument in response. So the C3 framework is about helping students understand how to use sources well enough that they can eventually write a really good argument in response. The book that we're reading does a couple things. Number one, it explains to us the researchers' kind of curriculum that they developed, and it also takes us step by step, beginning with chapter 3, through that curriculum so that we can actually go through the actual practices of the curriculum. So before we get moving, they decided that there were certain targeted skills for historical thinking. One, you have to be able to take a position in response to a question, and that is you need to be able to make a claim that's defendable. You need to be able to support an argument or a claim with evidence. You need to be able to explain how that evidence supports your position. And then you need to be able to evaluate the quality of the evidence. And the ways of evaluating the quality of the evidence for history is to think about the reliability of the author, to think about the time period in which the evidence was generated, and to think about the legitimacy and strength of the author's supporting evidence. So think about a reading practice in which those three different kinds of ways of evaluating evidence become part of the reading. That's what basically our book is going to be about that we're reading for the next couple of weeks. And then finally, you've got to be able to consider counter evidence. Now, chapters 1 and 2 are basically about the following. First of all, the researchers developed an historical thinking curriculum, which is 6 investigations that occur in 3-day cycles. So their first investigation involves the historical question, investigation 1 from chapter 3, who fired the first shot at Lexington Green? Now, with that question, the first day involves reading and annotating. And here they make sure that you're using conflicting sources. They don't want you to have right answers. They want you to weigh. So in order to weigh your evidence from those readings, they have, for day 1, they came up with this kind of curriculum called I Read. And I Read stands for Identify, Restate, Examine, Assess, and Determine. So on day 1, you do the I and the R. And the I is to identify an overarching argument by R, restating the main idea of each paragraph in your own words. So that means that you take your texts, and on day 1, you are going to just write margin notes and restate the main ideas of each paragraph. So this is very much a reading lesson. To identify the overarching argument, you have to be able to read each paragraph. And then as a teacher, you can help the students then come up with, well, given these main ideas per paragraph, what is the message in this text overall? So then from those, they can interpret the author's overarching argument in that particular text by looking at those main ideas. So you've got 2 texts, and you're going to do that with 2 texts. All right, day 2, you read and evaluate the evidence, and you look at 3 ways of judging evidence. So on day 2, you do the EAD of that curriculum, I Read. So you examine the author's reliability by talking about, okay, who is the author? What was that author's motivation for writing? And what type of document is it? So for type of document, what is the genre? Is it a letter? Is it a letter to a friend? Is it a legal document? What is the document? What is the author's motivation for writing? So you really think about that. And then you assess the influence of context over the writing. So who was the intended audience? And what was the occasion of the text created? So the historical documents typically that are read for history are documents that are very much contextualized with some kind of an historical problem. So you assess the influence of that context on the writing, and then you determine the quality of the facts. So who is that person? Does that person seem like a reliable source? What is the context for their writing? What is the genre? Are they writing a friend, or are they writing something that might be seen by more people? Is it an address that others will be hearing? So those kinds of clues help you to determine whether the facts are of good quality. Okay, so then after having done that kind of work, you've got those main ideas, you've come up with the main arguments, you're thinking about the reliability of the source by going through those 3 ways of judging evidence. And then on day 3, they have a curriculum called H2W, which is how to write. And they recommend very particular kinds of information in each of the sections of their argument. So their argument sections are an introduction, supporting paragraphs, rebuttal paragraphs, and a conclusion. Now, they also recommend that providing feedback to writers, so consider, actually, let me back up a bit. Consider having done day 1, day 2, day 3 on one question, then do the same thing on the second question, the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth questions. You could imagine that by the time you actually get through that sixth question, you'd have gone through this cycle 6 times. So your writing could feasibly improve if, in fact, and this is where this bottom piece comes in, the feedback that improves the writing. If a teacher gives really careful feedback, writing could feasibly improve over those 6 weeks. So the feedback that they recommend is PPG, which is the praise, name a strong element of the writing, polish, name something to work on, and then goal, help students set an attainable goal for the next writing piece. So this is working well. This needs to be tweaked in this way. Why don't you do this next time? So with the students getting that kind of feedback, they could feasibly improve by the end of the 6th session or 6th cycle.
Okay, before continuing on with Chapter 3, I just want to quickly review what days 1, 2, and 3 are. These are introduced in Chapter 3. So the authors recommend that on day 1 of this 6th cycle unit, you introduce the way that reading works in this kind of curriculum. And remember, day 1 is the goals are to identify the author's argument and to restate main ideas of paragraphs. So day 1 is reading of 2 conflicting texts. Day 2 is sourcing. So on day 2, you're really weighing different kinds of information that we can get about the texts and how they were produced and for what purposes. Weighing those texts' main ideas and arguments against one another based upon whether the sources are reliable or not. And then on day 3, the authors recommend that you write an argument. And the argument that they recommend, which they call How to Write H2W, includes this structure: an introduction, supporting paragraphs, a rebuttal paragraph, and then a conclusion. So keep this context in mind as we go through now Chapter 3, which is these 3 lessons. Now, I want to give you a heads up that, in fact, when you're doing days 1 and 2, you really need to do some sourcing and some thinking about the document, the context, the time, the problem that's being faced, the purpose of the author's writing. You really need to do a bit of this day 2 kind of work as you're doing the day 1 work of reading. So keep that in mind, and we'll go on with Chapter 3. All right, the authors begin Chapter 3 with an overview of the concepts that the 3 lessons deal with. They also go over disciplinary literacy practices, the very specific practice, and they show the links of those practices to 2 kinds of standards: the Common Core State Standards, which are now the Next Gen, and just know those Next Gen standards are very much aligned to the old CCSS. There are a few word changes, but basically they're similar. And then the C3 is the C3 framework for social studies. So this matters to us because we have 2 attributes in this course. They are disciplinary literacy and knowledge building, and also standards. So right here you have information about how the discipline of history and this specific curriculum is tied to standards. So let's just take a look at those columns at least. So what we're going to see here when we go through these lessons is these very specific disciplinary literacy practices. We're going to be sourcing and annotating historical texts. We're going to be taking a position in response to a controversial question, a specifically historical question, and we're going to be composing an introduction and conclusion of an argument. Now, those are tied to the Common Core state standards, which are also now the next gen standards. They're still similar. And then the C3 framework, those are history standards specifically. So you can go back when we get to the standards part of this course, you can go and look at what exactly those standards are in both the next gen and the C3. All right, I'm going to demonstrate for you what the first day of reading looks like in this curriculum. And remember, the first day is reading and doing the main idea restatements here and identifying the author's argument here. And you do that with 2 documents. So just to give you a little bit of background for those of you that are fairly new to reading, if you're new to our program, one of the ways that we teach reading is through guided reading. And guided reading can take many forms. And this is a form of guided reading. So you are guiding the reading, and a kind of a general way of thinking about guiding reading is that it follows the gradual release of responsibility model, so that it starts with I do, and that is the teacher demonstrating how they or she or he wants students to read. So it begins with I do, and then it's we do, and that's when the teacher with the students practice doing what the teacher had just demonstrated. And then there's the you do. And the you do is, okay, we've practiced together, now you try it on your own. Well, in this curriculum, on the first day, you do an I do with the first text. And then with the second text, you do a we do. So we'll demonstrate that now. All right, so we know that we need to identify the author's argument, and to do that we need to read and restate the main ideas per paragraph. Now remember that I had said that the day 2 expectations for this kind of a curriculum requires sourcing, etc. Even though that's day 2, you really need to do that a bit on day 1 as well. So this is how I would handle this text. So this is a text called Barker's Diary, and we have a headnote that explains who Barker is. So I'm going to read that and think about who he is. So Lieutenant John Barker was part of one group of British soldiers who were sent to destroy weapons the colonists had stored. Here he describes what happened when British soldiers marched into the town of Lexington on their way to destroy these weapons. Okay, I know a little bit. This guy's a lieutenant, and I know that this is a diary, and it's his diary because it's Barker's. And then I'm going to look at this source information at the bottom here. It says the source is, this is an excerpt that was adapted from his diary, Lieutenant Barker. And he was an officer in the British Army, and he wrote this on April 19, 1775. So, given that information, I'm going to think about what his purpose is for having written this text as he did. But that'll become part of my thinking as I go through the text. So, I'm going to begin. 19th. At 2 o'clock in the morning, we began our march by wading through a river that came up to our waists. So far, I'm not thinking a lot about anything. They're going up to get those weapons. They started awfully early. Why did they start so early? They must not have wanted to be seen. So, after going a few miles, we came to a town called Lexington. We heard there were hundreds of people gathered there who planned to go against us. Okay, so he'd heard that they'd be ready for them in a sense. So at 5 o'clock we arrived and saw a number of people between 200 and 300 formed in a field called Lexington Green in the middle of the town. All right, so what do I think the main idea is there that he's trying to get across? I would say that the British Army, intending to destroy colonist weapons, left early and upon arriving at Lexington found colonists awaiting. All right, that conveys what that paragraph tells us. I don't know much about his purpose at this point, other than to simply convey what he felt occurred on that morning. All right, I'm going to continue. We continued marching, keeping prepared against an attack, though without intending to attack them. Now, I find that interesting. They went up keeping prepared against an attack, but not intending to attack. Now, part of me thinks that might be believable because they left so early in the morning. Another part of me wonders about, well, what were they thinking, given that they did learn ahead of time that people were going to be there. So were they prepared to attack or weren't they? Would you ever, as a ethical army leader, take your army into an area where it's very possible you are going to be attacked and not intend also on attacking? Let's see. On our coming near, they fired 1 or 2 shots. Well, this is important. His account is that they were the first to fire those shots. As soon as that happened, our men, without any orders, rushed in upon them, fired, and put them to flight. So what does that mean, to put them to flight? Probably means they fled. We regrouped, but with some difficulty because our men were so wild they could hear no orders. All right, this is an interesting paragraph to me, and the main idea, trying to just stick with the facts as presented, is that the restating, I should say, of that main idea would be that the colonists fired at the British. And I think it's important to say the British were not organized. Now, we're going to get into the judgments as to, can we evaluate? Do we think that this is reliable information? Because part of the reading is to evaluate the author's reliability, to assess the influence of context on that document, and to determine the quality of those facts given all of that evaluation and assessment. So we're going to do that as we also do the same with the second text. Now, the second text is a we do. Okay, now before you start your we do, you're going to want to tell your students what you've just done because you're going to expect them to do the same. So you might just start a conversation about, did you notice some of the ways that I just read when I was reading? And the class might notice that you sort of talk to the text while you were reading. So you might get that information from them or simply tell them, I talked to the text. What else did I do? Try and get information from your students, the ways that you read the text, so that students might have noticed that you found out who the author was. They may have noticed that you found out the source and also the date. And they may or may not have noticed that while reading, I questioned whether I agreed with the info. In other words, I was a bit skeptical as I read. And I weighed the facts. I thought about why would they leave so early in the morning and not be concerned about whether someone might actually be at the Lexington Green when they got there. So I questioned whether they might actually believe or might actually have foreseen that others might be there waiting for them. So that's a part of my questioning the text. So you're going to ask students to do the same. You're going to tell them after you've had this discussion, and if they don't tell you you've done those things, then you can tell them, well, these are the things I did. And you're going to ask them to do as you did. as you do this together to find out who the author was, find out the source, find out the date, consider that context, what was happening at that time, talk to the text, and even question the text. One thing I also did was as I'm thinking of it now, is when I thought about words that were odd, like taking flight, I thought about what that might mean. So another thing we can do is consider new words. All right, so students will understand that you want them to do those things as they're reading. So go ahead and begin your we do now. And it works the same way. You'll explain, okay, we're going to need to identify this author's argument, and we'll do that by figuring out the main ideas per paragraph. So having just gone over the different things that I did, would someone like to begin the reading? So this is the we do, so you can collaborate on this. So invite someone to begin the reading and to start with possibly sourcing. So a student might say, well, a Minuteman wrote this, and it's a statement, and you could ask that student or any other student to go ahead and read the head note so we can learn more about that, or you yourself can. So on a we do, you can share the reading of this text in multiple ways. You could do the reading, students can do the reading, students can read silently, and then you discuss. There's multiple ways to do this. So let's just say you assigned this to someone to read. Maybe the same student that just said, well, it was from a Minuteman. All right, so the student might read, many colonists rebelled against British control by forming small groups of soldiers, also known as Minutemen. In this testimony, a group of Minutemen told their story about who was to blame for starting the Battle of Lexington Green. Okay, so after the student has read that, talk about that with the students and ask them how did they know where in the text they learned what Minutemen meant. So ask them to find it specifically in the text, because it says here, you want them to say, because it says here, also known as Minutemen. That's where we found out what Minutemen means. They're a small group of soldiers. So we know that this is a Minuteman statement, and that's as much as we know from the head note. Ask students if they can learn anything more about this particular text. And down below, they'll find the sourcing, so find out what they can about the sourcing. It's adapted from a sworn statement by 34 Minutemen before 3 justices of the peace in Lexington on April 25, 1775. As you talk about that, you can talk about that's an interesting thing that so many men are providing this account. You can talk about, oh, this is a legal statement. It's made in front of a judge, justices, 3 of them, and also talk about the date. It's different from the account that occurred in a diary on the 19th. That's going to play in the judgments that the students make about who's got the best argument or the most reliable argument. All right, so having done the sourcing and the discussion of the head note and who these Minutemen are, we can then go ahead and do the reading. So you can have a student read, or again, read silently and then talk, or you read. Let's say that I'd asked a student to read. We, Nathaniel Milliken, Philip Russell, followed by the names of 32 other men present on Lexington Green on April 19, 1775, all of lawful age and inhabitants of Lexington, do testify and declare that on April 19th at about 1 or 2 a.m. we were told that the British soldiers marching from Boston, that there were British soldiers marching from Boston toward Concord. Okay, so talk with the students about how can we state that as a main idea. Let them come up with some different ways. Explain to them that main ideas need to be inclusive of the important information in the passage, in the paragraph, and then rely on some or decide on one of those statements that are provided, or if they're not that great, then simply give them the statement. So it might be something like 32 Minutemen testified that they learned the British were coming toward conquered. It might be that the group decides it's important to put in the time early in the morning. If that's what people agree upon, then put in the time as well. Assign a student to read the next paragraph out loud, or ask them, why don't you read this one silently, and we'll talk about the main idea after. Either would work. We were ordered to meet at the field at the center of town on Lexington Green, where we were told by our captain to go back home, but to be ready to come back when we heard the beat of the drum. We further testify and declare that about 5 o'clock in the morning, hearing our drum beat, we returned and soon found a large body of troops marching toward us. So, according to their testimony, at 5 a.m., they went to Lexington Green, and you could say at sound of drum, and you could even say at sound of warning drum, because the British were marching there. All right, so these are statements. So I'm now still thinking as I'm reading about what does this really mean. So these are 32 people testifying in this way. Oh wait, this is followed by the name. So it's actually 34 people, isn't it? So 34 people testifying, and this is what they're remembering. To me, that seems like a lot of people to remember the same thing, and that's very interesting. So I'm going to continue on to the last paragraph. Why don't we all read this one? I would ask them to read one of those at least silently and then discuss. But for now, I'll just go ahead and read it out loud. At that point, some of our group were making their way toward Lexington Green, and others had reached it. Our men began to leave. While our backs were turned on the British troops, we were fired on by them, and a number of our men were killed and wounded. That's important because that answers our question that we're trying to answer, which is who fired the first shot. So, our backs were turned on the British troops. We were fired upon by them, and a number of our men were killed and wounded. To our knowledge, not a gun was fired by any person in our group on the British soldiers before they fired on us. The British continued firing until we had made our escape. All right, so a very different account of what happened there. So I will say some of the Minutemen left Lexington Green, and upon leaving were fired upon by British. That answers the question, who fired the first shot? They also said that to their knowledge, no one in their group had fired. But I think this main idea sums up our major purpose, who fired the first shot. So, given these main ideas from both this text as well as the previous text, we can think about the author's arguments. So, we know that this author's argument is the Minutemen's statement, actually. So, this is many authors. Their statement is the British fired the first shot at Lexington Green. And we could have, when I did the I should have actually written down that statement as well, which is, according to Barker, the colonists fired at the British, and the British were not organized. Now, for me, that lack of order matters because this is a lieutenant, and for some reason, it seems to me anyway, that he's kind of blaming his troops for not being very disciplined. All right, so now we've got the readings done, and that means that you can then go back to the students and say, okay, what did we do just now? Go back to the things that you asked them to do and ask them, did we talk to the text? We did less talking to the text and pretty much took it as it was written, except for in maybe one place where we talked to the text here, where we were thinking about why that was important. Did we find out who the author was? Yes, they did. They went to the Minutemen's statement, and they went to the headnote as well as to the sourcing. And so they did find out the source. They did think about the date ahead of time. Did they question whether they agreed with the information? It's interesting that we didn't question this time. And there were no we did consider new words. We thought about the meaning of Minutemen and how is it we knew what that meaning was. And we could have done more of this if it came up naturally. So by going over these different kinds of strategies of thinking like an historian while reading, you are teaching students to be metacognitive about things they can do with historical texts when reading them. All right, so that gives us an idea of day one, reading two texts, first as an I do and then as a we do. Now, the next day, day two, you can start thinking again, you'll return to those texts and you'll do these judgments. Okay, on day two, you will have already done the identification for each text of the author's argument and done the reading of reciting each main idea. So you can now become more critical and start thinking even more deeply about the reliability of each of those texts. So the authors recommend that you come up with a judgment by going through E, A, and D. And just to remind ourselves what those things are, the things you can do under E is to ask who wrote this document and what judgments can we make about him or her? And why did that author write the document? What's the purpose for that? What is the type of document? Who's that audience? And what's the occasion for writing? We have to judge the reason to doubt or to trust the author. Okay, consider both. So this is important here. So you want to consider both sides. In an historical argument, you may end up wanting to be persuasive, but the most persuasive argument is one that weighs both sides. So we have to consider both arguments to write a good argument. When we get to assess, that's about context. And the questions we need to ask are, how might the place have influenced the writing of the document? Compare the document location to the location of events. What else was going on at that time in history? Identify the historical events and compare to when the documents were written. And then, so that might matter a little bit when we compare the first document, which was written on the day of the event, to the second document, which was written several days later. And then finally, D, determine the quality of the author's facts and examples. So this is an issue of, do we trust these facts? What facts or examples does the author give to support the argument? How do the facts or examples support that argument? Where do the facts or examples come from? Which facts or examples are most persuasive? So let's go through that with our documents. Barker's diary. We're going to evaluate that reliability by asking those questions. So, Barker. Who wrote the document? Talk about who wrote it. Students could do this together with you as a whole class. You could ask them to do this in different cycles. Remember, there's 6 cycles with different documents and different historical questions in this curriculum. I would, for the first one, have this as a whole class so that you can assess how students are thinking about the documents. Don't have them work in partners until they've had experience with you thinking about the documents in these ways. So, who wrote the document and what judgments can be made about that person? Well, with Barker, we'd already learned that he was a lieutenant colonel. He wrote the document on April 19, the very date of the event. What else can we say? Why did they write that document? And what is the type of document and who's the audience? Well, we can assume that he wrote that document because he is a lieutenant, and lieutenants need to keep records of what occurs. And so, what seems reliable about that document is that it did occur, it was written on the very day of the event. Who was the audience? Well, it's a diary, but it's the kind of diary that will likely become a public record. So, very likely Barker knew others would read that document. All right, so next. What was the occasion for writing? Well, he had to record his day's events. Write one reason to doubt and one reason to trust the author on those events. Okay, so let's do that. Talk to the class about what might be a reason to doubt. I feel, at least in reading that, I doubted the argument because he seemed so wanting to kind of throw his soldiers under the bus. So I feel like I doubt the document because I didn't trust his willingness to blame his soldiers' lack of organization. And the reason I trust the document, I trust because it was written on the day of the event. The diary entry was written when the event was fresh. Now, students may have different reasons that they felt they doubted or trusted the document. And if they can support those reasons in the document itself, those are valid. All right, now let's move on to assessing the context. What was going on at that time? Well, we know that at that time, the British were taxing the colonists heavily. We know also that the colonists were definitely getting ready for a fight because they had weapons, so they were accumulating weapons. So what do we know about that context? It seems to me, and you have to have a discussion about this. This is not just getting something down. Really talk about what's going on at the time and determine what is that context and what matters as a class. And then as a class decide, okay, well, the colonists were preparing to fight the British. Due to overtaxing. All right, and determine the quality of these facts. What do we think about what was written there? It seems to me that everything in this first paragraph seems quite believable. Those times seem believable. It seems like they could have left at 2 in the morning and arrived at Lexington at 5 o'clock, and they did see a number of people there. What I question in these facts is it's questionable that the British were so unorderly. And that is, I think, is the main thing that I question here, because it seems to me that this lieutenant doesn't want to take responsibility for having fired the first shot. It seems possible that the British did fire the first shot, and he didn't want to take responsibility for that and was therefore blaming his disorderly men. Now we'll do the same thing with the next document. Let's evaluate the statement. I trust that 34 Minutemen corroborated the statement. That's a lot of people That to me adds credibility to that statement. What I don't trust is that the Minutemen would turn back. I feel I don't trust that they'd turn back. I mean, they clearly were getting ready. They were told to go there to Lexington Green if there was a drum beat. They got a drum beat. Why would they go there, see the men coming towards them, and turn back? That does not seem like reliable information to me. Why would they turn back when they were very much prepared? They had that stockpile of weapons. It seems like this is the very moment they were waiting for. All right, and then assessing. So the British were taxing the colonists. They were fed up. Can we trust these facts? What do you think? You'd have a discussion about that, and that's what's going to make this history so lively for your students. So let them have their discussion and write down what they determine in terms of the trustworthiness of those facts, the reliability of them. So one of the things that they might also come up with is that it's interesting that this document was written, a full, 6 days after the event. So time can play a little bit of a part in the trustworthiness of this document too. So that might go into the determination of the reliability of facts, the trustworthiness of the facts. Having done those two discussions, then the students will be able to take a stand based on the facts. That is thinking like an historian. You have done this reading and writing to learn to get them to this point, reading in a particular way, following a particular format that will help them make judgments as historians do. Okay, the third day of the first cycle of the 6-cycle curriculum that's introduced in this book is for students to write their first essay. Now, importantly, the authors recommend that they not write the full essay, that they only write the intro and they write the conclusion in the first cycle of this curriculum. So, what I want you to do is each of you, having gone through this entire lecture, having hopefully done some skimming and reading of the chapter 3 itself, that you now decide for yourselves how to write your intro and conclusion. You're going to submit your intro and conclusion to Blackboard, and students are going to respond to which is the better argument and how you're using evidence. So this is what you're going to do. You're going to recap the event, which is who fired the first shot. So who was involved, what happened, when and where, according to the documents. Second, write one sentence that explains the historical question, and that is who fired the first shot at Lexington Green, why people disagreed about who fired that first shot. And fourth, write an answer to the historical question, taking care to include the name and or author's perspective. So you're going to basically make a claim choosing what you feel has the strongest evidence. Is it going to be Barker, or are you going to take the Minutemen's evidence as the best evidence? Then you're going to write a conclusion, writing your answer to the historical question by comparing the two documents and explaining why someone should choose your perspective over the other perspective. Connect your ideas to what was happening in the historical context. You're going to submit this to Blackboard, and it's going to be discussed by others in the class. And basically, I'm doing this so that you will have a sense of how might you help students, having experienced this, how might you scaffold their writing of the intro and the conclusion.